Can you imagine a human being completely parasitized by Cordyceps fungi? The girl before us had merely inhaled a tiny amount of fungal spores, and soon mushrooms began sprouting from her thighs. Strange fungal blossoms emerged from her arms, and tendrils of fungus slithered out from her ears, as if she had been singled out as a target. The fungus was constantly attempting to take control of her body. This was the true horror of the ancient forest. A terrifying airborne fungus drifts through the woods, and if a passerby accidentally inhales it, it rapidly spreads through their body at an astonishing speed. Yet, it does not kill them immediately. Instead, it breeds ceaselessly within them until it completely seizes control, turning them into its puppet. Its ultimate goal is to spread and dominate the entire world. This was once an ordinary primeval forest, until two rangers ventured inside. They were here to investigate whether there were poachers, but fate had chosen this moment to set their nightmare in motion. First, their drone seemed to capture footage of a human figure in the forest. When they tried to fly it closer to get a better view, the camera suddenly showed a man, his body covered in mud. The sudden turn of events made Gabi suspect there were poachers in the area. She instructed her partner, Winston, to drop her off on shore, while she went alone to retrieve the drone. However, she did not realize that her drone had already been taken, and even the surveillance cameras they had set up in the forest had been covered. And the ones responsible were not poachers, but what appeared to be indigenous inhabitants of the forest. Emaciated, gaunt figures who laid traps throughout the area as if they were hunting Gabi and Winston. After setting their traps, they arrived at a grove of withered trees, donned masks, and struck a mushroom. Immediately, its fungal spores dispersed into the air. The spores drifted outward, as if they possessed a life of their own. As Gabi pressed forward, she suddenly seemed to see a gigantic, moving mushroom. But when she blinked, it disappeared. At the same time, an eerie, unidentifiable sound echoed through the forest. Believing that a predator was lurking nearby, Gabi intended to turn back, but she had unknowingly stepped into a trap set by the indigenous people. A sharpened wooden stake pierced through her foot. She tried to call Winston for help, but just then, she caught a glimpse of a strange creature darting past her. Realizing Winston might not make it in time, she had no choice but to endure the pain and forcefully pull out the stake. Her agonized scream immediately reached Winston's ears. Sensing that his partner was in danger, Winston hurriedly turned back toward the boat to retrieve a weapon. But in his panic, his radio fell into the water. Now the two were completely cut off from each other. Gabi gritted her teeth and removed the stake from her foot. Just as she was about to stand up, she suddenly saw a red glow in the distance, and the sky instantly darkened. With no other choice, she forced herself forward, following the glow. Eventually, she arrived at a wooden cabin deep in the forest, but there was no sign of anyone inside. Thinking it was merely a temporary shelter for other rangers, Gabi did not hesitate to enter and stay there for the time being. Meanwhile, Winston continued his search for Gabi, but now that night had fallen, he had clearly lost his way, and worse yet, he seemed to be stalked by something. Alone and without support, he had no choice but to hide and evade pursuit. However, as he crouched behind a massive tree, he turned to find a monstrous figure standing behind him. Helpless, he could only flee. But in this unfamiliar forest, how could he possibly escape the creatures tracking him? Back in the cabin, Gabi suddenly experienced a violent coughing fit. She coughed up a chunk of flesh-like material, which shockingly began to change, rapidly becoming bizarrely beautiful. The unsettling sight made Gabi extremely wary. At that moment, two men suddenly barged into the cabin. They were the same gaunt figures she had seen before. One of them immediately pressed a knife to her throat. Panicked, Gabi quickly explained and apologized. Fortunately, these two were not truly indigenous forest dwellers. They could even speak the language of the civilized world. After hearing her out, they released Gabi and even helped treat her injured foot. The older man introduced himself as Barend, and the younger one was his son, Stefan. They were not originally from the forest but had been living there for over 20 years. However, they did not explain the reason behind their prolonged stay. Later, they prepared food for Gabi. Seeing that they meant no harm, she told them about the creatures she had encountered, but Barend and Stefan did not respond to her concerns. Instead, they prepared an unusual herbal remedy and applied it to her wound. The next morning, Gabi had not yet regained consciousness, perhaps due to the effects of the herbs. As Stefan changed her bandages, He seemed to develop a strange interest in her. When his hand touched Gabi's thigh, grotesque mushrooms suddenly sprouted from his body. When Gabi woke up, she noticed the strange phenomenon. Having no idea what was happening, she could only forcefully tear the fungi off she. By then, Berend and Stefan had already gone out hunting. Unsure of what to do, Gabi once again tried to contact Winston. She had expected to receive no response, but surprisingly, Winston's distressed voice came through the radio. Then, the signal abruptly cut off again. Since she still could not move freely, Gabi had no choice but to stay in the cabin. She planned to boil some water, but unexpectedly discovered a hidden compartment beneath the wooden floor. Opening it, she found a photograph of a woman. She wanted to investigate further, but just then, Berend and Stefan returned. Having no other option, she quickly put everything back in place. After returning, Berend warned her that they could not move around during the daytime. It would attract unwanted attention, but when Gabi asked who they were, Berend did not answer. That night, recalling the woman's photograph, Gabi cautiously probed Stefan about his mother. Berend explained that his wife had been a scientist. When she was diagnosed with cancer, he brought her to this forest, the place where they had first met. Stefan was conceived here. After his wife passed away, Berend chose to raise his son in the forest, and here they encountered them.
Wie goed.
As Gabi listened, she suddenly realized something shocking. Her foot, which had been pierced just 2 days ago, had completely healed. Could it be that something truly extraordinary existed in this forest? Later that night, Gabi was abruptly awakened by Berend, who covered her mouth. Judging by their expressions, something serious was happening. Berend whispered that they could not see, but they could hear. If they entered, she needed to press herself against the wall. He also told her to smear a strange black substance on her body. Just as she was doing so, an eerie tendril stretched toward her. A loud noise shattered the silence. The wooden door was violently broken down. The creatures poured into the cabin, one after another. After they were finally driven away, Stefan rushed to Gabi and stripped off her clothes to remove the creature's blood. Only then did Berend explain. The creatures were a type of Cordyceps fungus, a parasitic species with intelligence. They particularly loved humans, as they craved human eyes, mouths, and lungs. Once a human was infected, the fungus would first seize control of their muscles. When the infection reached maturity, the host would be connected to the fungal network, allowing it to replicate rapidly. Eventually, when the host was fully assimilated, the fungus would devour them and replace them with an identical, monstrous copy. Berend claimed that these fungi were the largest living organisms on Earth. They had existed far longer than humans, constantly growing and evolving. Judging from their current state, they had already developed consciousness, perhaps even intelligence rivaling that of humans. The next morning, when Gabi awoke, she noticed something unusual. Stefan had not gone hunting that day. She sat down beside him and took out her smartphone to show him. Having lived in the jungle since childhood, Stefan was fascinated by the phone. But just as he was curiously examining it, Berend suddenly stormed in, snatched the phone and smashed it to pieces, almost as if he saw it as some kind of evil object. Afterward, he took Stefan with him and led him to a large tree. He placed a piece of meat in front of the tree, and after a prayer, the meat visibly began to decay at an astonishing speed. Seeing this, Berend then poured a bottle of blood into the tree hollow, and soon after, golden needle mushrooms sprouted from within. Berend plucked 2 of them, one for himself and one for Stefan. Once this ritual was complete, they returned to the wooden cabin. At that moment, they also noticed that mushrooms were still growing continuously from Gabi's hands. Stefan seemed to understand why she was developing these fungal growths, but under the weight of his father's authority and his own lack of fluency in human speech, he could only try to communicate by licking her hand. But how could Gabi possibly understand? Since her wound had fully healed, Gabi decided to go out and search for Winston. With Berend accompanying her, they set off. Berend was extremely familiar with the forest, and before long, they found Winston. But he was no longer human. His entire body had been parasitized by the Cordyceps fungus, yet he was still alive. Sensing Gabi's arrival, Winston regained consciousness, but he was already on the verge of being completely controlled. He knew he didn't have much time left, so he pleaded with Berend, placed an arrow in his own mouth, and ended his own life. Since the Cordyceps fungus was connected through a vast fungal network, Winston's death immediately alerted the other creatures. To avoid danger, they had no choice but to abandon Winston's body and retreat to the wooden cabin. That night, Gabi suddenly felt something inside her ear, but when she woke up, it was gone. At the same time, she noticed that her thighs had also begun to grow fungal structures. She knew she was infected, but there was nothing she could do. In desperation, she asked Berend if there was an antidote. Berend did not answer her and instead walked out of the cabin. Seeing that he ignored her, Gabi turned to Stefan and asked about his mother. His response was completely different from Berend's version of events. According to Berend, she had died long ago, but Stefan said she still lived in the forest. Yet he did not explain further, only saying that he would take Gabi to see her. Meanwhile, Berend had returned to the same tree from earlier in the day. He once again offered a piece of fresh meat and began to pray, but this time, no golden needle mushrooms sprouted from the tree hollow. Instead, an eerie red glow emanated from within. Defeated, he returned to the cabin, his spirit visibly shaken. Fortunately, nothing unusual happened that night. The next morning, the mushrooms on Gabi's legs had grown even more numerous. She no longer dared to tear them off. As she wondered what to do, Stefan suddenly ran in from outside, kissed her, and then spit a golden needle mushroom into her mouth, urging her to eat it immediately. The moment she swallowed it, the mushrooms on her legs began to recede into her body. Seeing that she could actually be cured, Gabi decided to stay and continue living with them for the time being. Sometime later, Stefan took her to see his mother as promised. What Gabi saw stunned her, a massive tree that could breathe and move. Stefan told her that this was his mother, who had now merged with the tree. It was the same tree where Berend performed his prayers for the golden mushrooms. Gabi was shocked. She never imagined that a plant could fuse with an animal, but she did not outwardly show her emotions, knowing that the father and son were hiding many secrets. She decided to investigate in secret. When they returned to the cabin, she deliberately provoked Berend, hoping to force him into revealing the truth about the forest. Sure enough, Berend, enraged, declared that humans were nothing more than maggots living under neon lights. He said they had no right to rule the world, as they only brought endless self-destruction. Now only the fungal system of the forest could save the world. They were the true gods destined to reclaim dominion over the earth. They would grow, thrive, and one day take complete control over all of humanity. Then, Berend ground a mysterious powder, while Stefan painted red markings on Gabi's chin. Berend blew the powder into her nose. Gabi immediately fell into a trance. When she regained awareness, she found herself in an unknown world. Before her stood a towering tree. As she touched its bark and closed her eyes, she suddenly perceived the entire cycle of the world's changes, as if she were outside the flow of time itself. When she woke up again, she was by the river. Stefan emerged from the water, and in that moment, Gabi felt as if they were as pure as the first humans. Then, they experienced the bliss of union. When she awoke once more, she found herself before the same tree where Berend had prayed. She felt as though she were merging with the tree itself, sensing how it was breathing through the air, just like an animal. Dark red tears flowed from her eyes. Then she suddenly woke up in bed. Berend told her that this was the secret of the forest. It was a single, unified entity, long ago taken over by the fungal system, and now it was poised to become the new ruler of the world. The next morning, Gabi realized the gravity of the situation. While playing with Stefan, she secretly whispered to him, suggesting that they escape together. That night, when Berend left as usual, they made their move. But before they could leave the forest, they ran into Berend. One glance, and he immediately understood that Gabi was trying to take his son away. Without hesitation, he began persuading Stefan to stay. Perhaps due to growing up in the forest and his deep bond with his mother, Stefan ultimately chose to return with Berend. Gabi initially planned to escape alone, but the more she thought about it, the more unwilling she became, so she turned around and ran back. When she returned to the cabin, she saw Berend leading Stefan away. Without hesitation, she entered the house, grabbed their bow and arrows, and followed them. Berend led Stefan to the sacred tree. He made Stefan kneel before it, removed his clothing, and swiftly cut a wound into his back with a dagger. Then he forced Stefan onto the ground, where vines immediately coiled around him. Just as Berend was about to sacrifice Stefan, Gabi arrived. She did not hesitate. She shot an arrow straight into Berend's thigh, but this gave Berend an opportunity to fight back, knocking Gabi to the ground. Just as he was about to strike her down with an axe, Stefan suddenly lunged forward. At that moment, a monster appeared, setting its sights on Gabi. Stefan had no choice but to fight the creature, giving Berend another opening. He dragged Gabi toward the tree, intending to sacrifice her as well. Though Stefan managed to overpower his father, the monster had already locked onto them. With no choice, they abandoned Berend and fled back to the cabin. The next morning, as Stefan slept, Gabi picked up Berend's journal. Inside, he had written about how humanity was on a path to destruction, unwilling to change. He wrote that they only needed to give humanity a little push, and they would destroy themselves. He compared humans to caged monkeys, violent, hoarding limited resources, enforcing hierarchy through sexual coercion. With each passing day, humanity's world became more of a prison. Soon, he wrote, they would witness the greatest reckoning in history. Gabi was horrified, but she knew it was too late for her to escape. She had already been injured and infected. She thought she would die here with Stefan, but even as the fungus spread across her body, Stefan remained completely unaffected. Only then did she realize Stefan had fully merged with the fungi. He was conceived, born, and raised within the fungal system. He was its most perfect human replication. Gabi had merely served as a vessel for his evolution. In the end, Stefan was the true victor. With Gabi completely consumed, all of her knowledge and memories were absorbed into the fungal network and passed on to Stefan. He took this knowledge into human civilization. He sampled human cuisine in a restaurant, and with him, he carried the rapidly spreading Cordyceps plague.